Welcome to my channel. Try to hear the latest story.
My name is Sheldon, and at 32 years old, I've always been the different one in my family of high achievers. When my wildlife photography career became the family joke, I learned to smile through their ridicule. But at that fateful dinner when my sister introduced her doctor boyfriend, I never expected their usual mockery would lead to the moment that changed everything. Before I tell you how I turned this humiliating dinner into the moment that changed my family forever, let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe if you've ever had to prove your family wrong. Growing up in an affluent Connecticut suburb meant certain expectations. Our colonial-style house with its manicured lawn and circular driveway represented everything my parents valued: status, appearance, and traditional success. The Westbrook name meant something in our community. My father, Thomas Westbrook, wasn't just any doctor. He was the chief surgeon at Greenwich Memorial, the man who saved lives and commanded respect wherever he went. His patients included celebrities and politicians. The hospital wing named after him stood as a physical monument to his achievements. At home, he was equally commanding, his word, the unquestioned law. My mother, Diana, matched him in ambition and status as a corporate attorney at one of New York's most prestigious firms. She represented Fortune 500 companies in litigation that made national headlines. Her designer wardrobe and perfectly maintained appearance were as much a part of her identity as her sharp legal mind. Together they formed an intimidating power couple that our community both admired and feared. Then there was my sister, Amanda. 3 years younger than me, but already following perfectly in our father's medical footsteps. By 30, she was a promising surgical resident at the same hospital where Dad reigned supreme. She inherited his clinical detachment and mother's social grace. Amanda always knew exactly what to say, what to wear, and how to please our parents. I, on the other hand, was the anomaly. From childhood, I found more comfort in nature than in country clubs. While my family discussed hospital politics over dinner, I'd be mentally framing the perfect shot of a blue jay outside our dining room window. My room was filled with nature books instead of medical journals. My first camera, a beat-up Nikon I bought with lawn mowing money when I was 13, became my most prized possession. Photography is a hobby, Sheldon, not a career, my father declared countless times. Westbrooks are doctors and lawyers, not struggling artists. Even in high school, when my wildlife photos won state competitions, these accomplishments were dismissed as extracurricular activities that would look good on medical school applications. My parents indulged my passion only insofar as they believed I would eventually outgrow it. The breaking point came during my third year of pre-med at Yale. I was maintaining a respectable GPA while secretly submitting photos to nature magazines. When I sold my first image to a regional wildlife publication, I felt more pride than I ever had acing a biology exam. That night, I called my parents, hoping finally for approval. "That's nice, honey," my mother said distractedly. "But have you started your MCAT prep? Applications are due in 6 months." The next day, I dropped out of pre-med and switched my major to environmental studies with a minor in photography. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my parents over one of our mandatory Sunday dinners, my father's face turned such a deep shade of red that I genuinely worried he might have a stroke. "You're throwing away everything we've built for you," he shouted. "Everything we've sacrificed." My mother's approach was different but equally painful. "Sheldon, darling, you're just confused. Let's make an appointment with Dr. Murray. He's a wonderful therapist." Amanda sat silently, watching me become a disappointment in my parents' eyes. Her slight smile told me everything. With me out of the running, she would now be the sole recipient of their pride and approval. The years that followed were financially difficult. I moved into a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, so small I had to convert my bathroom into a darkroom on weekends. I took whatever photography gigs I could find: weddings, events, portraits to pay rent while building my wildlife portfolio during every free moment. My parents' approach shifted from anger to pity. "How's the photography thing going?" became their standard question, the slight pause and emphasis making it clear they expected me to have given up by now. When I couldn't afford to join them on their annual Aspen ski trip, my mother told relatives I was finding myself rather than admit I was scraping by on a photographer's early career income. Family dinners became exercises in endurance. Each gathering featured the same routine: father highlighting Amanda's accomplishments, mother subtly questioning my life choices, and Amanda basking in her role as the child who hadn't disappointed everyone. "Your cousin Patrick just made junior partner at his law firm," my mother would announce. "Remember how you two used to compete at everything?" The unspoken comparison hung in the air. These gatherings grew more infrequent as I focused on my career. I'd begun to gain traction with smaller nature magazines, and my Instagram following was growing steadily. Last year, I spent 3 months in Montana capturing the daily life of a wolf pack, an assignment that paid modestly, but built my reputation among wildlife photographers. Not that my family noticed. When I mentioned this project during Thanksgiving dinner, my father changed the subject to Amanda's new research grant. My small victories remained invisible at home, my passion still reduced to an immature rebellion in their eyes. Despite everything, some stubborn part of me still craved their approval. I kept showing up for family events, kept mentioning my small successes, kept hoping for some acknowledgement that I hadn't made a terrible mistake. But as the years passed, that hope grew thinner, replaced by a quiet determination to succeed on my own terms. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was editing photos from a recent bird migration series. Her voice carried that forced cheerfulness that always put me on edge. "Sheldon, darling, we're having a special family dinner this Friday. Amanda has someone important she wants us to meet." I knew immediately what this meant. Amanda had been dating someone new for a few months, and apparently, this one had lasted long enough to meet the parents. In our family, bringing someone to dinner was practically an announcement of serious intentions. "I'm pretty busy with a project deadline," I hedged, though the truth was, I'd rather spend the evening cleaning my camera lenses than enduring another Westbrook family inquisition. "This is important to your sister." My mother's voice took on that slight edge that meant refusal wasn't an option. "Everyone will be there. 6 o'clock sharp. And Sheldon?" She paused. "Wear something appropriate." After hanging up, I stared at my calendar. The dinner fell exactly 3 days before I would hear back about the National Geographic submission, a photograph of a rare mountain lion mother and cubs I'd spent weeks tracking in Colorado. If accepted, it would be my first major breakthrough. Part of me wanted to wait until I had news, maybe, finally, something that would impress them. But experience had taught me that hypothetical success never counted with the Westbrooks. Only tangible, preferably framed credentials on the wall mattered. For the next few days, I vacillated between dread and a faint, foolish hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe Amanda's happiness would soften the usual dynamics. Maybe her boyfriend would be someone interesting who might actually care about photography or nature conservation. Friday evening arrived with depressing speed. I stood in front of my closet, trying to decipher what my mother meant by appropriate. I settled on dark jeans and a blue button-down shirt that didn't have any visible wrinkles. Professional enough to avoid immediate criticism, but not so formal that it looked like I was trying too hard. I even polished my one decent pair of shoes. The drive from Brooklyn to Greenwich always felt like a journey back in time. With each mile, I could feel myself reverting from independent adult to disappointing son. I rehearsed neutral topics of conversation and prepared standard responses to the inevitable questions about my career situation. "Just get through dinner," I told myself. Smile, deflect, escape. The memory of last Thanksgiving flashed through my mind, my father's pointed questions about my retirement plan, non-existent, and health insurance barely adequate. My mother's suggestion that her friend's law firm was always looking for bright young people for their administrative team. Amanda's smug smile as she described her new luxury apartment. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, the imposing colonial house loomed before me, windows glowing with warm light that somehow never seemed to reach me. The contrast between this house and my cramped apartment always struck me anew. Here, space was abundant, furniture was heirloom quality, and every object had been selected for its ability to impress visitors. Maria, the housekeeper who had been with my family since I was a child, opened the door. Unlike my parents, her smile was genuine. "Mr. Sheldon," she said warmly. "So good to see you. You're looking too thin. They haven't started yet, you can still sneak a cookie from the kitchen." It was our old routine from when I would come home from school, hungry and looking for comfort. Her small kindness nearly undid me. "Thanks, Maria," I said, hanging up my jacket. "How are things here?" "Same as always," she replied with a knowing look. "Your sister's young man seems nice, very polite." That was Maria code for appropriate Westbrook material. I nodded, already feeling the weight of expectations settling on my shoulders. Outside the dining room, I paused to gather myself. Through the doorway, I could hear the murmur of conversation, my father's authoritative tone dominating, punctuated by feminine laughter that must belong to my mother and Amanda. A deeper, unfamiliar voice occasionally joined in the boyfriend, presumably. I straightened my shirt, ran a hand through my hair, and took a deep breath. For a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving before anyone saw me. But some stubborn part of me, pride perhaps, or just plain stubbornness, propelled me forward. "You're Sheldon Westbrook," I reminded myself. "Your work matters, even if they don't see it yet." With that thought steadying me, I stepped into the dining room and into the familiar performance of being the family disappointment. "There he is." My mother's voice carried across the room, pitched slightly too high. We were beginning to think you'd gotten lost. The familiar dining room, with its dark cherry table and ancestral portraits, felt like a stage set for the evening's performance. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier, and the good china only used for special occasions was arranged with precision. "Traffic," I muttered, though I'd actually been sitting in the car for 10 minutes, delaying the inevitable. My father barely looked up from his conversation, acknowledging me with just the slightest nod. Amanda, however, was on her feet, pulling forward a tall, broad-shouldered man with perfect teeth and a confident stance. "Sheldon, this is Jackson," she said, her voice tinged with unmistakable pride. "Jackson, my brother Sheldon." Jackson extended his hand with the confident grip of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His watch, which I couldn't help but notice, was a Rolex worth more than all my camera equipment combined, gleamed as we shook hands. "Great to finally meet you," he said, with what seemed like genuine interest. "Amanda's told me about her photographer brother." I wondered exactly what she'd told him. Probably that I was the family charity case, the cautionary tale of potential squandered. "All good things, I hope," I replied with the practiced smile I reserved for these occasions. "Of course," Amanda said quickly, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "Jackson's just finished his residency in neurosurgery at Mass General. He's joining Daddy's department next month." Of course he was. I should have predicted this. Amanda would naturally find someone who would further cement her place in our father's world, someone who would fit seamlessly into the Westbrook vision of success. "Impressive," I said, because it was expected. "Drinks before dinner?" my mother interjected, already moving toward the bar cart. "Jackson, another scotch?" "Sheldon, we have that beer you like." By that beer I like, she meant the only beer brand she considered acceptable in her house. I accepted the bottle without correcting her. The seating arrangement came as no surprise. My father at the head of the table, my mother at the opposite end, Amanda and Jackson along one side in the positions of honor, and me, across from them, where my father would have to turn his head to acknowledge my existence. The first course arrived, some elaborate seafood appetizer that Maria had undoubtedly spent hours preparing under my mother's exacting instructions. "Jackson was just telling us about the revolutionary procedure he's developing," my father said, pointedly not including me in the conversation that had obviously been in progress. Jackson launched into an explanation of some neurosurgical technique that had my father nodding with approval and my mother watching with the expression she reserved for people she deemed worthwhile. Amanda kept touching his arm possessively as he spoke, occasionally glancing at me to ensure I was witnessing her triumph. I nodded at appropriate intervals while studying the dynamics around the table through the mental viewfinder I'd developed over years of observation. If this were a wildlife documentary, the hierarchies would be clear. The dominant male, my father, his chosen successor, Jackson, the female reinforcing social bonds, my mother, and the junior female securing her position through an advantageous mate selection, Amanda. And then there was me, the outlier, the one who didn't strengthen the pack. "And what about you, Sheldon?" Jackson asked suddenly, breaking my anthropological reverie. "Amanda mentioned you've been working on some projects recently." A brief, awkward silence fell. My sister shot Jackson a warning look that he missed entirely. My mother became very interested in rearranging her silverware. "Yes," I said carefully. "I've been focusing on North American predator species. Just finished a series on mountain lions in Colorado." My father made a small noise that might have been a suppressed snort. My mother jumped in with practiced smoothness. "Sheldon's always had such an active imagination. Even as a little boy, he'd spend hours in the woods behind the house." The subtle diminishment was so familiar I almost didn't notice it anymore. The way she spoke of my career as if it were a childhood phase I hadn't outgrown. Actually, I started to explain about the magazine interest in my work, but Amanda interrupted. "Jackson just purchased the most beautiful property in Cambridge," she announced. "Tell them about the historical features, honey." And just like that, the conversation swerved away from me again. As Jackson described crown moldings and original hardwood floors, I caught my parents exchanging a satisfied glance. This was what success looked like to them: real estate, possessions, status. The main course arrived, giving me a brief reprieve from the performance. The food was excellent: prime rib cooked perfectly, roasted vegetables arranged with artistic precision, potatoes whipped to cloud-like consistency. I focused on eating while the conversation continued to flow around me. "We're thinking of having the hospital fundraiser at the club this year," my father was saying. "Jackson, you'll want to join, of course. I'll put your name up for membership. More territory marking, more club membership, the Westbrook way." Throughout the meal, I noticed something unsettling. Whenever I would speak, offering a brief comment or answering a direct question, my family members would exchange quick glances, sometimes raised eyebrows, sometimes subtle eye rolls, sometimes just that knowing look that excluded me from some shared understanding. The pattern became increasingly obvious. I'd speak, they'd look at each other, a silent communication would pass between them, and then someone would redirect the conversation. Jackson seemed to notice too. I caught him watching this dynamic with slight confusion, though he was trying hard to fit in with his potential future family. As dessert was being served, my mother's famous crème brûlée, which she pretended to have made herself, though Maria had undoubtedly done all the work, Jackson turned to me again. Perhaps he felt sorry for me, or maybe he was just being polite. Either way, it set the stage for what came next. "So Sheldon," he said in a friendly tone, "Amanda mentioned you do photography, but I don't think I really understand what exactly you do for work day to day. What does a wildlife photographer's life look like?" The table went quiet. Too quiet. I opened my mouth to answer, to explain my process, my goals, the magazines I contributed to. But before I could form the first word, my mother's voice cut through the silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "Don't embarrass us," my mother said sharply, her smile brittle and fixed. "Not tonight." The table erupted in laughter. Not light, good-natured chuckles, but the kind of laughter that builds walls and establishes sides. My father's deep rumble, my mother's practiced society titter, and Amanda's sharp, vindictive peal. Jackson looked momentarily confused but joined in with an uncertain laugh, obviously not wanting to be left out of the family bonding. "Maybe lie this time," Amanda added, smirking across the table at me, "so you don't sound so pathetic." The words hit like physical blows. My throat tightened, and a familiar burning sensation spread across my chest. 20 years of diminishment concentrated into 2 sentences. "I don't understand," Jackson said, glancing between Amanda and me. My father leaned forward, placing his hand on Jackson's shoulder with conspiratorial male bonding. "Sheldon likes to believe he's a professional photographer," he explained, his voice dripping with condescension, chasing animals through forests and such, a hobby he never outgrew. "Unlike a real career," my mother added pointedly, "like medicine or law." I sat frozen, the half-eaten dessert forgotten before me. This was hardly the first time they'd belittled my career, but something about doing it so brazenly in front of a stranger, making me the family joke for a newcomer's entertainment, cut deeper than usual. The dinner table suddenly felt miles long, the distance between me and them uncrossable. I was transported back to childhood dinners where my report card was never quite good enough, to teenage years when my father questioned why I couldn't be more like Cousin Patrick, to college when my mother introduced me as our son who's still figuring things out even when I was a Dean's List student. He had such potential, my mother was telling Jackson now, as if I weren't sitting right there. Yale pre-med, you know. Could have joined his father at Greenwich Memorial, but he decided photography was more fulfilling. She pronounced the word, as one might say, delusional. Amanda was practically glowing with malicious pleasure. Remember when he lived in his car for 3 months to photograph some bird migration? She added. Dad had to bail him out when his vehicle got impounded. This was a deliberate mischaracterization. I'd slept in my SUV during a sandhill crane migration project, a common practice among wildlife photographers, and the vehicle had been ticketed, not impounded. I'd paid the fine myself, but the false narrative made for a better cautionary tale. The Westbrook legacy, my father intoned, lifting his wine glass in a mock toast, 3 generations of medical excellence, and 1 artist. The pause before artist contained multitudes of disapproval. I felt my face burning but maintained a neutral expression through years of practice. Inside, something was building a pressure behind my ribs that had been accumulating for decades. Jackson, to his credit, looked increasingly uncomfortable. I actually think wildlife photography sounds fascinating, he offered, an obvious attempt to ease the tension. Oh, it's a wonderful hobby, my mother said dismissively. Just not a career for someone from a family like ours. A family like ours, my father repeated solemnly, builds legacies, contributes meaningfully to society, achieves excellence in fields that matter. The unspoken conclusion hung in the air. Unlike what you do. Amanda, perhaps sensing Jackson's discomfort, placed her hand on his arm. Sheldon's just different, she explained, as if diagnosing a harmless but unfortunate condition. We've learned to accept it. The condescending tone, the patronizing head tilt, it was all so familiar, this performance of tolerant superiority. They had cast me as the family eccentric, the wayward son, who needed their patient understanding rather than an adult who had chosen a different but equally valid path. I thought of the countless dawn mornings I'd spent, lying motionless in muddy hides waiting for the perfect shot, the freezing nights in remote mountains tracking elusive predators, the technical skill I'd developed, the knowledge of animal behavior I'd accumulated, the networks I'd built with magazines and conservation organizations, none of it visible or valuable to the people who should have been my strongest supporters. As the mockery continued, my mind drifted to the email I'd received that morning, the one I hadn't mentioned yet, the one from National Geographic's photography editor. I'd been checking my phone obsessively for 3 days waiting for their response, and it had finally arrived days earlier than expected. I looked around the table at my family, still entertaining themselves at my expense. My mother's perfectly arranged hair and surgical precision with emotional cuts, my father's authoritative posture, so accustomed to deference that my independence felt like personal betrayal. Amanda, who had chosen compliance over authenticity, reinforcing the family mythology to secure her position, and for the first time, I felt something beyond hurt and disappointment. I felt pity. Pity for people so trapped in their narrow definition of success that they couldn't recognize it in any other form. In that moment, watching them laugh, I made a decision. I would no longer seek their approval or validation. I would no longer measure my worth through their distorted lens. I smiled. It wasn't the appeasing smile I usually wore at these dinners, the one that signaled I would absorb their jabs without protest. This was different. This was the smile of someone who suddenly sees with perfect clarity. My change in demeanor must have been noticeable, because the laughter gradually died down. My mother looked at me with slight confusion. My father's brow furrowed. "Something funny, Sheldon?" Amanda asked, annoyed that I wasn't playing my assigned role of shamefaced disappointment. "Actually," I said calmly, reaching for my phone, "I do have something I'd like to share." My phone felt heavy in my hand as I pulled up the email I'd received that morning, the one I'd read at least 20 times since it arrived, the one that had made me pull my car over because my hands were shaking too hard to drive safely. "I wasn't going to mention this," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, since it's not a medical breakthrough or a legal victory. But since we're discussing my career choices, something in my tone silenced the table. Perhaps it was the unusual confidence, so different from my typical defensive posture at these gatherings. This morning, I received an email from James Winterton, I said, watching for any reaction to the name. Nothing. Of course, they wouldn't know who the senior photography editor at National Geographic was. He informed me that my photograph of a mountain lion mother and cubs has been selected for next month's cover. I turned my phone around, showing them the mock-up of the magazine cover featuring my photograph, a powerful female mountain lion standing protectively over her 3 cubs at sunrise, mountains silhouetted in the background. The golden light catching the mother's eyes made her appear almost mythical, while creating a halo effect around the family unit. My name, printed clearly at the bottom, photographed by Sheldon Westbrook. The silence that followed was unlike any I'd experienced in this house. My mother's face went slack, the social mask dropping to reveal genuine surprise. My father froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips. Amanda's mouth opened slightly, no clever retort forthcoming. Jackson was the first to respond. "That's National Geographic," he said, leaning forward to look more closely at my phone. "That's incredible. Congratulations." His genuine enthusiasm highlighted the stunned silence from my family. I could almost see their mental recalibration happening in real time. "Well, my mother finally managed, her voice higher than usual. Isn't that nice? A hobby that occasionally pays off, still trying to minimize it. Still unable to acknowledge what this actually meant. It's not just the cover," I continued, scrolling to the next part of the email. "They've offered me a contract for a 6-month assignment, documenting endangered predator species across 3 continents. The advance alone is more than a first-year surgical resident makes." I looked directly at Amanda as I said this. My father cleared his throat. "Winterton, did you say? Any relation to Senator Winterton?" Of course, that would be his first question, searching for a connection that would explain this anomaly. Some nepotistic reason my work had been selected rather than accepting its merit. "No relation that I'm aware of," I replied. "James Winterton has been with National Geographic for 20 years. He's one of the most respected editors in wildlife photography." Amanda had recovered enough to attempt damage control. "That's wonderful, Sheldon," she said with a brittle smile. "A nice validation of your passion project." But I wasn't finished. I scrolled to the final paragraph of the email. They're also featuring an 8-page spread of my Wolfpack documentation from Montana last year. The series will be considered for the Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition, which is sponsored by the Natural History Museum in London. Jackson let out a low whistle. "I've seen those exhibitions. They tour worldwide. The competition is incredibly selective." I nodded, allowing myself to acknowledge the achievement. "The acceptance rate is lower than getting into Yale Medical School." My father flinched slightly at the comparison. Direct hits to his value system were rare from me. "May I?" Jackson asked, gesturing to my phone. I handed it over, watching as he scrolled through the email with genuine interest. "This is seriously impressive. The technical skill alone to capture these images, and to get this close to predators in the wild. It's not without risk," I acknowledged, "or without significant technical knowledge and physical demands." My mother's expression had shifted from shock to something more calculated. I could almost see her mentally rephrasing the story she would tell her friends, no longer the tragic tale of her wayward son, but perhaps now the exciting narrative of her creative, adventurous boy making a name for himself. "Well," she said, smoothing her napkin, "we always knew you had a good eye. Remember those little drawings you used to do?" The attempt to infantilize my achievement, to connect it to childhood doodles rather than years of professional development, was so transparent I almost laughed. "This isn't about having a good eye, Mother," I said firmly. "This is about building a career through persistence and skill, despite having absolutely no support from my family." The bluntness of this statement caused another round of uncomfortable silence. We didn't speak this way in the Westbrook household. We spoke in implications and subtle digs, not direct confrontations. "Now, Sheldon," my father started, his authoritative doctor voice emerging, "that's hardly fair. We've supported you in many ways. Have you? I asked, surprising even myself with the challenge. Can any of you name a single photography exhibition of mine you've attended? A single publication where my work has appeared before tonight? Can you even describe what my specialty is within wildlife photography? The silence was answer enough. Jackson, still examining my phone, looked up with growing admiration. These wolf images are extraordinary. The composition, the lighting, and getting this close to a wild pack? How did you even do that? For the first time that evening, I found myself explaining my work to someone who was genuinely interested. I described the months of research, the gradual process of habituating the wolves to my presence from increasing distances, the technical challenges of shooting in variable mountain light. As I spoke, I became aware of a subtle shift in the room's energy. My parents were listening, actually listening, with expressions I rarely saw directed at me. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Reassessment. Amanda watched Jackson's evident admiration with poorly concealed annoyance. The contract, my father said when I finished explaining, his business mind engaging. What exactly are the terms? I outlined the financial arrangement, the international travel schedule, the publishing rights. With each detail, I could see his mental calculator running, eventually arriving at the unavoidable conclusion that my hobby had transformed into something legitimately profitable and prestigious. So you'll be published in National Geographic, my mother said slowly, testing how this new information fit into her social framework. That's quite visible. Translation. Her friends might actually see it. It might reflect positively on the family. Yes, I agreed. And the magazine has 12 million print subscribers, plus their digital platform reaches over 50 million people monthly. This number, the audience scale, finally seemed to penetrate. My father sat back in his chair, reassessing me with new eyes. Amanda, perhaps sensing her position as the successful child slipping, attempted to regain control. Jackson's research has been published in several medical journals, she interjected. That's wonderful, I said sincerely, turning to Jackson. What's your research focus? Jackson, who seemed to be the only person at the table without an agenda, launched into an explanation of his work on trauma-induced neurological conditions. Unlike my family's typical medical discussions designed to exclude and establish superiority, Jackson spoke passionately, but accessibly about his research. That sounds fascinating, I said when he finished. Actually, during my time with the wolf pack, I documented some interesting neurological effects in an older wolf that had survived a moose attack. I wonder if there might be some parallels to your research. Jackson leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. I'd love to see that documentation. There's growing interest in comparative neurology across species. For the first time in my adult life, I was having a real intellectual exchange at the Westbrook dinner table. More surprisingly, it was with Amanda's boyfriend, the person who should have been most invested in maintaining the family hierarchy. My father cleared his throat. Perhaps we should move to the living room for coffee. It was his standard signal that dinner was concluding. But as we stood, the usual dynamics had been disrupted. Jackson moved to walk beside me, rather than following my father as male guests typically did. Amanda quickly inserted herself between us, taking his arm possessively. As we moved toward the living room, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd finally impressed my family, though their shocked faces had admittedly been satisfying, but because I suddenly realized how little their approval actually mattered to me anymore. The living room maintained the same formal elegance as the rest of the house, antique furniture, arranged for appearance rather than comfort, family photos displaying achievements rather than moments of joy. My mother busied herself directing Maria about coffee service, while my father selected a brandy from the drinks cabinet. I took a seat in the armchair furthest from the center, my usual position at the periphery of family gatherings. But something had changed. The energy in the room had shifted, with uncertain glances replacing the usual confident dismissal. So, my father said, handing snifters of brandy to Jackson and himself, pointedly not offering me one, this photography, opportunity. It's a one-time thing, I assume? And there it was. The attempt to reclassify my achievement as a fluke rather than the culmination of years of dedicated work. Some things never changed. Actually, I said, accepting a coffee from Maria with a grateful smile, It's the result of a portfolio I've been building for nearly a decade. National Geographic doesn't offer contracts to photographers without established credentials. What Sheldon means, my mother interjected smoothly, is that he's been very persistent with his hobby. Something inside me finally snapped. Not in a dramatic, table-flipping way, but in the quiet severing of a cord I'd been clinging to for too long, the hope that they would someday genuinely see me. "It's not a hobby, Mother," I said quietly but firmly. "It's my profession, a profession I've pursued despite years of active discouragement from every person in this family." The directness of my statement created a palpable tension. We didn't speak this way in the Westbrook house. We spoke in implications and cutting asides, not open confrontations. "No one discouraged you," my father said dismissively. "We simply wanted what was best for you." "What was best for me?" I repeated, feeling decades of suppressed frustration rising to the surface. "Or what would reflect best on you?" "Now, Sheldon," my mother began in her placating tone. "No," I interrupted, surprising everyone, including myself. "I've listened to you diminish my choices for years. Tonight, you'll listen to me." I turned to my father first. "When I was 16 and won the state youth photography competition, you didn't even attend the ceremony. You said, and I quote, 'Taking pretty pictures isn't an achievement worth celebrating.' Do you have any idea what that felt like?" My father's face flushed, but whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. Before he could respond, I continued. "When I got my first magazine publication, Mother told her friends I was between jobs, as if I was unemployed, rather than working 80-hour weeks building my portfolio." I shifted my gaze to Amanda. "And you?" "When I spent 3 months tracking that wolf pack, living in difficult conditions, developing new technical approaches, gathering data that's being used in conservation efforts, you told everyone I was camping to avoid real responsibilities." Amanda had the grace to look slightly abashed, though she quickly recovered. "Well, it did seem rather convenient that you disappeared when Dad needed help moving offices." "I was working," I emphasized. "Just because my office is sometimes a mountain range doesn't make it any less legitimate than a hospital or courtroom." Jackson, who had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort, attempted mediation. "It sounds like there have been some misunderstandings about the nature of wildlife photography as a profession." "There's been no misunderstanding," I countered. "They understand perfectly well. They just decided long ago that any path that deviated from their narrow definition of success wasn't worthy of respect." My mother's face tightened. "We've only ever wanted you to have security and stability," she said defensively, "to achieve your potential." "My potential," I repeated. "Do you even know what my potential is, Mother? Have you ever asked what I want to achieve with my work? What drives me? What challenges I've overcome? Or have you been too busy waiting for me to fail so you could say, 'I told you so'?" The question hung in the air. For perhaps the first time, my mother seemed genuinely at a loss for words. My father, uncomfortable with this direct emotional confrontation, attempted to redirect to safer territory. "This National Geographic business, what's the long-term prospect? Surely it's not sustainable as you get older." "Actually," I said, "many of the most respected wildlife photographers continue working well into their 60s and 70s. Franz Lanting is over 65 and still does fieldwork in remote locations. But more importantly, experienced photographers develop multiple revenue streams: image licensing, books, speaking engagements, workshop teaching." I could see my father processing this information, reluctantly adjusting his narrative. "The advance for this project alone," I continued, "is more than I made all of last year, and the exposure from a National Geographic cover typically increases a photographer's market value significantly." "Well," my mother said, clearly trying to reframe the situation in a way that worked for her, "we're certainly happy for this recognition. Though I do wish you'd mentioned it earlier in the evening." The implication being that I had deliberately withheld the information to make them look bad. Typical deflection. "Would it have made a difference?" I asked. "Would you have skipped the part where you told me not to embarrass you, where Amanda suggested I lie about my career to sound less pathetic?" Amanda shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a joke, Sheldon. You're being overly sensitive." No, I said firmly. I'm finally setting boundaries after years of tolerating disrespect. There's a difference. I stood up, suddenly certain of what I needed to do. I've spent my entire adult life trying to earn your approval, while you've spent that same time finding new ways to withhold it. That ends tonight. My father's expression darkened. Now see here. No, I interrupted. Something I'd rarely dared to do. You see, I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need you to understand or value my work. I've found success on my own terms, and I've found people who appreciate both me and my photography for what they actually are, not what they should be. My mother's hand fluttered to her throat, her standard gesture when losing control of a situation. Sheldon, darling, you're being dramatic. No one has ever said we don't support you. You've said it in 1,000 ways, I replied. Every dismissive comment about my little pictures. Every time you introduced me as still figuring things out when I was actively building a career. Every family dinner where my work wasn't deemed worth discussing while Amanda's rotation schedule was treated like breaking news. I turned to Jackson, who was watching with wide eyes. I apologize that you had to witness this. It wasn't my intention to create this situation, but perhaps it's better that you see the family dynamic clearly before you become part of it. Jackson nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty, he said carefully. Amanda shot him a look of betrayal. You're taking his side? I'm not taking sides, Jackson replied, but I can see why Sheldon feels undervalued. This unexpected support from the newest member of the inner circle created a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. My father looked stunned. My mother seemed to be calculating how to regain control of the narrative. Amanda was furiously trying to communicate something to Jackson with her eyes alone. I picked up my jacket from where I draped it over the chair. I'm going to head out now. I have an early flight to Wyoming tomorrow to photograph bald eagles for a conservation project. You're leaving? My mother asked, genuinely surprised. Family dinners typically ended when my parents decided, not before. Yes, I said simply. I've said what I needed to say, and I have work to prepare for. Sheldon, my father began, his tone softening slightly. There's no need to rush off. We can discuss this further. I recognized the approach, the first conciliatory gesture when someone stepped out of the usual family script. It wasn't genuine change, just a tactical retreat to re-establish control. There's nothing more to discuss tonight, I said. I'm not angry, but I am finished pretending that the way you've treated me and my career is acceptable. If you want to have a relationship with me going forward, it will have to be based on mutual respect. I moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. And if you're ever actually interested in understanding what I do, you're welcome to attend my exhibition opening at the Garson Gallery next month. I'll send the details. With that, I walked out, leaving behind a silence more profound than any I'd ever created in that house. As I closed the front door behind me and stepped into the cool evening air, I felt a weight lifting, the weight of expectations I'd never be able to meet, judgments I'd never deserved, and approval I no longer needed. Driving away from my childhood home, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Only a quiet, growing certainty that I was finally free to be exactly who I was meant to be. The days following that dinner were strangely quiet. No angry phone calls from my father, no passive-aggressive messages from my mother, no snide texts from Amanda. The silence was unprecedented and, in its own way, more unsettling than their usual tactics. I focused on preparations for my Wyoming assignment, organizing equipment and researching bald eagle migration patterns. When thoughts of the confrontation intruded, I reminded myself that I had spoken my truth after years of silence. Whatever came next, I had that knowledge to sustain me. 3 days later, as I was packing my final items for Wyoming, my phone buzzed with an email notification. National Geographic had finalized the cover layout. Seeing my photograph officially positioned on their iconic yellow border, my name credited beneath it, brought a surge of emotion so powerful I had to sit down. This moment, this validation of my path belonged entirely to me. It wasn't inherited or expected. It wasn't chosen for me or achieved to please anyone else. It was mine alone, earned through perseverance, skill, and an unwavering commitment to my vision. The Wyoming assignment proved challenging, but rewarding. Tracking eagles along the Snake River in winter conditions required every bit of my technical skill and physical endurance. But the resulting images, powerful, majestic birds against snow-covered landscapes, were among my best work. When I returned to my Brooklyn apartment 2 weeks later, I found an unexpected package waiting. Inside was a framed copy of my National Geographic cover with a note, "Congratulations on your achievement. This deserves to be displayed properly. Jackson." No message from Amanda, just this thoughtful gesture from her boyfriend. I was hanging the frame when my phone rang, an unknown number. "Sheldon, it's your mother." Her voice sounded different, hesitant, almost vulnerable. I braced myself for the usual tactics: minimization, guilt, subtle manipulation. "I saw your magazine," she said, after an awkward pause. "At Caroline Davis's house, of all places. She subscribes, apparently." She was. Quite impressed when I mentioned you were my son. I waited, sensing there was more. "I realized I've never actually seen your work before. Not properly. It's quite striking. The way you captured that mountain lion looking directly at the viewer. There's something almost human in her eyes." This was new territory. My mother actually commenting on the substance of my work rather than its conformity to her expectations. "She's protecting her cubs," I explained. "I spent 11 days tracking that family unit. The mother knew I was there but determined I wasn't a threat." 11 days? My mother repeated, sounding genuinely surprised. "In the wild? Where did you sleep?" "In a tent some nights. Other times in my vehicle when the weather was too severe." A long pause followed. "I never really understood what your work entailed," she finally admitted. "I assumed that I was just wandering around taking snapshots?" I suggested when she trailed off. "Something like that," she acknowledged, and I heard what might have been a hint of remorse in her voice. "Your father and I. We've been talking about what you said at dinner." I remained silent, unwilling to make this easier for her. "We may have been short-sighted. Regarding your career choices," she continued with evident difficulty, "your father found some of your other publications online. He was particularly interested in the conservation aspect of your work with the wolf pack." This was as close to an apology as Diana Westbrook had likely ever offered anyone. I recognized the enormous effort it must have required from her. "Thank you for saying that," I responded, neither accepting nor rejecting the olive branch. "It means something to hear you acknowledge my work." "Your exhibition," she said tentatively, "the one you mentioned, is that invitation still open?" "It is," I confirmed. "March 10th, at the Garson Gallery in Manhattan." "We'll be there," she said, with the decisive tone I recognized from childhood, the one that meant the matter was settled. "Your father has already put it in his calendar." After we hung up, I sat looking at the framed magazine cover. One conversation wouldn't erase decades of dismissal, but it was a start, a small crack in the foundation of a relationship built on conditional approval. The following months brought changes I couldn't have anticipated. The National Geographic cover opened doors that had previously been firmly closed. My inbox filled with assignment offers, speaking engagement requests, and licensing inquiries. The 6-month Predator documentation project expanded to include educational components and a potential book deal. My exhibition at the Garson Gallery exceeded all expectations. The space was packed for the opening night, and to my genuine surprise, my entire family attended. My father, uncomfortable in the artistic environment but making a visible effort to engage. My mother, who had clearly researched enough photography terminology to make appropriate small talk with other attendees. Even Amanda came, though she spent most of the evening ensuring Jackson stayed close to her side. "This is extraordinary work, Sheldon," Jackson said, examining a large format print of 2 wolves silhouetted against a mountain sunrise. "The composition, the lighting, it tells a complete story in a single frame." "That's the goal," I acknowledged. "To capture not just the animal but its context, its relationship with the environment." My father cleared his throat. "The gallery owner mentioned you're documenting habitat destruction in the Pacific Northwest next month?" The fact that he'd sought out this information independently, that he'd initiated a conversation about my work, felt like a seismic shift. "Yes," I confirmed. It's part of a larger conservation project focused on salmon spawning grounds and the predator species that depend on them. He nodded thoughtfully. There are some interesting public health implications to that ecosystem collapse. My colleague at the CDC published a paper on related disease vector changes last year. It wasn't effusive praise or a complete understanding of my work, but it was an attempt to find common ground to build a bridge between his world and mine. For Thomas Westbrook, this represented enormous growth. As the months passed, our relationship slowly transformed. The change wasn't dramatic or complete. My parents still occasionally made comments that revealed their fundamental worldview remained intact. But there was effort now, a conscious attempt to see me as I was, rather than as they had wanted me to be. Amanda took longer to adjust. Her identity had been so thoroughly built around being the successful child that my rising professional standing threatened her self-perception. Our interactions remained strained, though the open hostility had faded. Jackson, surprisingly, became something of an ally. His genuine interest in my work created an unexpected connection, and we occasionally met for coffee when I was in town. Through him, I gained insight into my sister I'd never had before: her insecurities, her desperate need for validation, her genuine intelligence often overshadowed by our parents' expectations. The greatest change, however, was within myself. The success that followed the National Geographic cover was gratifying, but it wasn't what healed me. What healed me was the realization that I no longer needed my family's approval to feel whole. I had found my own measure of worth in the quality of my work, in the conservation impact of my images, in the authenticity of my chosen path. 1 year after that fateful dinner, I found myself in the Serengeti, photographing a lion pride for a major conservation organization. As the rising sun bathed the savanna in golden light, I watched a lioness guiding her cubs across the open plain, confident, purposeful, untroubled by the opinions of those not essential to her journey. In that moment, I understood the most important lesson of my life. True success isn't measured in degrees or titles or others' approval. It's found in having the courage to follow your authentic path, even when that path leads away from everything familiar and expected. My family may never fully understand or embrace my choices. They may never see my success through anything but their own limited lens. And that's okay, because I no longer need them to validate what I already know to be true: that a life lived authentically, in pursuit of genuine passion, is the only measure of success that truly matters. Have you ever had to stand your ground against family expectations to follow your own path? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and share with someone who might need encouragement to follow their authentic path. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply being true to yourself.